Hi, this is Deborah Kitko, genealogy librarian with the Wayne County Public Library. This is going to be a first of several series talking about some cemetery records that we have in our collection. I want to talk briefly just a little bit about cemetery records. A lot of times people come to our department and they're looking for the place of burial for the individual. I mean, they may have looked online already in terms of like the death certificates. They may have looked at Find a Grave, Billions of Grave, Ohio Graves, the U.S. GenWeb website, a lot of places just trying to locate the final resting place of their loved ones. And a lot of times they often cannot find where that place of burial is. A lot of people think that burial records have been kept from the beginning of time, and that is not necessarily the case. Early on, there's a good possibility that loved ones may have been buried on a family farm, or they may have been buried at a churchyard in a graveyard area. And there's a good possibility that either the church records haven't survived, or no one had recorded really all the burials and where they're buried at. Or over time, the tombstones, they may have never had a tombstone, or the tombstone may have just eroded or fallen beneath the surface, or whatever the case may be, where there's no record of their loved ones being buried there. An example in mine would be my grandmother used to, she would talk frequently about a cemetery down in Washington County, Ohio, the Lehigh Cemetery, that she remembers that as a young girl, there was a beautiful arch that had full of roses, and the cemetery was just full of individuals, most of which would have been connected to her through her family. And she was always, one of the dying wishes that she wanted was that we'd find a complete record of all those that are buried there in that cemetery. To this day, we have yet to find that record. And although she remembers that the cemetery was just full of tombstones, the last time we were there, probably about 2003, 2004, there may be 14 standing tombstones that survive. And the only record of those that are buried in there would be what you may find through the Township Records, through the newspaper, through an obituary, possibly through a death record, if there's some that was buried that time period. And there is a listing at the Washington County Public Library in their genealogy division that actually has a list of some of the individuals that were buried there. It's not complete by any means. And that's just one example, and we've had other people that's come in our department, like I said, they just can't find evidence of it. So some of the sources, a lot of the local societies, especially here in Ohio, some down in West Virginia, other places have actually compiled what they call as burial records. A lot of times these are just tombstone inscriptions, which means that volunteers from the society would go out and stone by stone would copy down the inscriptions, or at least the names, the birth date, the death date, and then create a publication of that. Well, the problem comes in is that sometimes the cemeteries would not be lined up in perfect rows. And so, the volunteers may have accidentally missed a tombstone, or they may be not able to read the tombstone, or the tombstone just doesn't exist anymore. So there's a good possibility that your loved one or your ancestor may have been buried in that cemetery, but there's just no record of that cemetery. Now, I've already mentioned a few places that you can go to online where you can actually try to find some information about the burial places of your ancestors. If you're here in Ohio, in 2003, the Ohio Genealogical Society actually published a book, and this book is called Ohio Cemeteries from 1803 to 2003. And this is a statewide project that a lot of individuals put some time in, but they actually try to go and record the location of all the known cemeteries. Now, since this book was published in 2003, this is, 17 years ago. So there's probably been quite a few other cemeteries that have been found, or there could be some different information in here that some incorrect information, or some other ways. But this is a good starting point. So if you know that you have someone buried in Holmes County, for example, there's a listing in this book of all the cemeteries known at the time in 2003 that existed down in Holmes County. And this book actually gives the name of the cemetery, it gives the location of the cemetery, and sometimes there's a notation in terms of how many stones may be there, and some other affiliated information, such as religion or ethnicity. Of course, in Holmes County, you're going to find a lot of Amish cemeteries, so you have that notation in here too. If you're checking at the more local level, you may have something like what we have here in our department. This was put out through this Wayne County Cemetery Preservation Society, which was started in 2001. This is a location guide for the cemeteries of Wayne County, Ohio. And this is done by local volunteers from that Preservation Society. And it's divided by township, and it gives a listing of all the known cemeteries within that township. Some of them do not exist anymore. And so, for example, here's Beaver Cat Cemetery, which is in Worcester City, and it was in Section 9 of Worcester Township. And this is actually located underneath the Worcester Brush Company's building at this point. Just a notation there, a little bit of brief history. And you see there's a dot here, and this dot would correspond with the dot over here. So you'd find, so this is dot number 12, so you find number 12 over here on this map right here, so you actually have a visual way to see where that cemetery would be at. Also at the time, Larry Knox and his team included the GPS readings. So if you have a smartphone, you can actually plug in the GPS, and that can take you exactly where that cemetery should be. Another source we have here in our department that is very unique, and I have not seen this anywhere else, but it could definitely exist in other places, was what is known as a gravedigger's record. And this we found in one of our vertical files here years ago. And one of our staff members actually went through and did a transcription of the information. This is burial records from January 1943 through June of 1967. And it actually gives you the last name of the individual, the first name, the year of the death, the place of burial. Now, a lot of times it doesn't necessarily say which cemetery. It just says Lake Fork, Ohio, or Columbus, Ohio, or Burbank, Ohio, Canaan and Creston. But this is what the original one looks like. And you'll see that as you read through this is death of 1943. Use a little bit of imagination with how the gravedigger actually spelled the name, because I think he spelled it the way it sounded, which is quite common. But this is another source that would be available here in our local library here in Worcester that may give you some insight into some of the burial places of some of your ancestors. Another possibility is maybe looking in the township minutes. A lot of times it was the duty of the township early on for those that were paupers or those that were disadvantaged economically or financially, that the township would be responsible for burying them. So the only record you may find about the death of a loved one or a previous ancestor could be found in the township minutes or in the township records. So that would be another source. We do have some here. It's not complete, though. With something like that, you have to contact either the villages or the township or the different municipalities here in Wayne County to see what they may have. So this is just a basic introduction. Once again, just keep in mind that there may not necessarily be a written record of the death or the burial place of your individual. You may have to look around through obituaries, through death certificates, through gravedigger's cards. You may, if it's a newer cemetery, from like maybe the late 1800s forward, there may be some records of those that are buried there. And a couple of the projects that the cemetery group has done, which I'll talk about here in another segment, they actually worked with the different townships and with the historical societies or the cemetery and actually compared the tombstone inscriptions that they gathered with the actual records. So, and we'll talk, like I said, we'll talk a little bit about that a little later on. So for now, this is just a basic introduction. I'm going to talk about more specific records here and in the next few segments. So hopefully this helped. If you have any questions, feel free to contact our department. Our phone number is 330-262-0916, or you can send an email to our department. It's Genealogy, that's Genealogy, @wcpl.info.